It's encouraging that they forget to come in at the same time as well, isn't it? I remember the pain I felt. I think I cried when I first read about Pastor Scott Willis and his wife Janet. I've told you their story before. It was a beautiful day, August 1994, and Scott and his wife, who were and still are good, genuine, upright people. They're not perfect people, because none of us are, but they were blameless people. They loved Jesus. They're genuine, lovely people. They loaded 6 of their 9 kids into their people carrier, and they set off to visit their eldest son at university. A couple of miles down the road, the car in front of them hit some debris, or hit something. Something fell off it, actually, and it bounced on the road, and it bounced underneath their car, and it split their fuel tank. And immediately the fuel tank ruptured, exploded, set fire to the car. Scott and Janet jumped out. They tried to get round to the doors to get to the kids, but they couldn't do it. And they watched all 6 of the children die in a fireball. And you read that, you think, why? They were good people. They were God-fearing people. They didn't deserve something like that to happen. Why did it happen to them? You know, knowing the excruciating mental torment they have to carry with them for the rest of their lives, why would a loving God let something like that happen? If it had to happen, then why not to a drug dealer or a paedophile or someone like that? Why them? The good people. Or why did a lovely young Christian girl called Joni, who faithfully loved and followed Jesus, why did she jump into some water as a teenager and it paralyzed her for the rest of her life, when there are people who take stupid risks every day and are okay? Why did my parents, who are upright and godly and the most honest people I know, why did they lose their life savings when wicked members of the family brought a bogus legal suit against them? Why didn't that happen to people who are always fiddling the system? Why did it happen to my mum and dad? There are lots of whys, aren't there? You know, why do people have to bury the kids? Why do people have to say, well, why was it me that was abused? Why has cancer ravaged my family and left my kids without a mum or my kids without a dad, when there are wicked people who are living healthily? One of the questions that victims of crime often ask, and victims of abuse ask, is why? Why did this happen? If we could understand why it happens, maybe we can move on a little bit. And the thing is, that question often goes unanswered, doesn't it? It's like a final form of torture. Never find out why. And we know we're not perfect. We understand our theology, don't we? We know people are not perfect, so in that sense, nobody deserves a clean run. But there are some things that happen to people and you think they've done nothing to deserve what's happened. So why does God allow it? If he's so loving and so powerful, why does he allow it? Well, the book of Job looks at that question. But it's not a neat answer. There isn't a line between being a good person and having a good life. There's lots of questions as we look at Job, lots of questions that get unanswered. If God's loving and in control, why does he let this happen? And it's not some academic exercise. This is what I've struggled with as I'm looking at Job. I'm thinking, am I looking at this just academically when it's not an academic book, is it? At different levels and at different times, we all have or we all will suffer. Some of you in here and online have suffered horrendous pain, horrendous heartbreak, horrendous injustice. And some of you can honestly hold your hands up and say, listen, I know I'm a sinner, but I've done nothing wrong in this situation. I am innocent in this situation. I haven't done anything to deserve this. And we hear well-meaning friends and they say to us, well, God meant it for good, but it doesn't help you. You know, you're going through some trauma, and, well, God means it for good, and it might be true, but it doesn't help you, because we want to know why. We often never find out why. People might say to us, God will use it to refine you. God's shaping you. God's dealing with you. He must have a lesson for you to learn. And as you're struggling to get through the day and you hear him saying it, you lovingly want to smack them. Because they're coming to you from their armchair. I don't think I've ever quoted Shakespeare, but this line seems to fit. He jests at scars that never felt a wound. He jests at scars who never felt a wound. One writer says, the book of Job is wheelchair theology, not armchair theology. And as we'll see, Job's friends, they speak from the comfort of an armchair. They're armchair theologians. You know, it brings the picture of me. When I was at seminary, we'd be analysing different things, and you can analyse the text. You could say, well, let's analyse the text of the book of Job from our armchair, and let's look at the Hebrew of it, and this and that. But Job's not an armchair theologian. Job's a wheelchair theologian. Job does his theology. We learn about God in Job from a place of pain, not a place of comfort. And the question that comes to us as we look at Job is, well, how do I maintain faith and trust in God at the darkest times when I don't have an answer? It's as real and as raw as it gets, the book of Job. And in the case study of Job, I think it's probably, humanly speaking, it's the most extreme example of loss you'll ever find. You know, Scott Willis, horrendous loss. You could say, well, he had his health. He didn't lose his home. Job loses everything. And when all of this happens to Job, the question is, will his faith in God be enough? Why? Why does Job love and trust God? So it's a tough book. It takes a long time for Job to work through his issues. There are basically, in the middle of this book, we're not going to cover them individually, there are 30-odd chapters of therapy. 30-odd chapters of Job talking it through with people, good and bad advice. And again, I think that's realistic, isn't it? We don't face a crisis and we don't face a trauma and someone comes and explains theology to us and we skip off into the sunset and it's all sorted. Recovery takes time. Therapists say that, when someone's dealing with a trauma, it takes between 2 and 4 years for them to not get over it in the sense of completely, but to start actually the life come back to some normality. It takes 2 to 4 years. We've got till Christmas, so we'll try and do it before then. But this morning we're going to have an overview of the book, and then we're going to look at the first 12 verses. And all we're going to do this morning, we're going to ask 5 questions about the book, just to set us up. Some have got really short answers, some are long. 5 questions about the book. First one, where? It's quite a straightforward question. Where's this book set? Well, we're told that Job is from the land of Uz. We've got no idea where Uz was, except that almost certainly it wasn't in Israel. It's in the east somewhere. Where's this book set? We're also told it's set in heaven. Behind Job's experience in this physical place of Uz, there's an invisible realm to our world. We know that, don't we? We're sat in Holbrooks now, but there's an invisible realm to our world. There's a world where angels operate and demons operate and where God operates. And chapter 1, it's set in the throne room of heaven. It's like a court scene. And we get to see, we've got to keep this in our mind, we get to see in chapter 1 something that Job never sees. Even at the end of the book, Job doesn't see what's happening in the background. That's one of the challenges we've got to face in Job. We see in Job, we know what's happening behind the scenes. We know really, at least if we don't know the whole detail, we know what's going on for Job to be suffering. Job doesn't. He never gets to see behind the scenes. We see the conversation between God and Satan. Job doesn't. Not even at the end. And the challenge is, with Job not seeing what's going on behind the scenes, will he trust God? And that can be the same for us, can't it? We can't see the bigger picture when things happen in our lives. We can't see God's big plan. And we've got to trust him even when it doesn't seem to make sense. That's the where. The when. When did all these things happen? Again, we don't know. It's thought that Job was a really early book. So although it comes just before Psalms, although it comes at the end of the history of the Old Testament, if you like, we think that Job was, or the events of Job took place round about the early chapters of Genesis. The truth is we don't know for certain, but we think it took place round about the early chapters of Genesis probably. But the point is, it's an old book. And it's a book about something that's been relevant from the beginning of Genesis right and through the day that Jesus returns. Who? We're on question 3 already, but they get longer now. Who? There are 4 main characters in the book, 4 main sets of characters in the book. Firstly, there's Job. Who was Job? Well, Job was a genuinely godly bloke. Ezekiel refers to Job as one of the 3 godliest men ever to have lived. We read in verse 1, Job was blameless and upright. Again, that doesn't mean Job was perfect, but there was a quality about Job's life that you couldn't find dirt on him. If someone was to investigate Job's life, they couldn't find anything that would destroy his reputation. There was an integrity about Job's life. There was a goodness about Job's life. He stood out as being a good bloke. Why did he stand out? Because, again, in verse 1, he feared God and he shunned evil. He loved the Lord. And when he knew that the Lord wanted him to do something, however he came to that truth, he walked in it and he thought, I'm not going to do what's wrong. We also know that Job was rich. In fact, Job was mega rich. By today's standards, Job was a billionaire, one of the wealthiest men on the earth, because we're told that he was the wealthiest man in all of the East. You know, think like these rich sheiks who own Manchester City and all them kind of people. That's the level Job's on. We read he's got 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a massive household staff. Job had huge blessings. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had people to share his wealth with. And we see how godly he is in verse 4 and 5. We're told that when his kids have feasts, after they've had the feast, he goes to the Lord early in the morning and he thinks, Lord, if my kids have sinned, I'm just going to pray now that you protect them and that you'd forgive them. And he's got a real spiritual concern for his kids. So Job is really, really wealthy, but he's also a really, really good bloke. Probably as good an example, humanly speaking, as you can find of a person in history. You know, you got your Jobs, you got your Daniels. He's in that kind of league. So Job's a very good bloke, but he's very, very wealthy. Second character, Satan. Satan's introduced in verse 6. It is like a courtroom scene. And God summons all the angels. And he summons Satan. We were talking yesterday with someone, I've been talking in the week. You know, how come Satan could just walk into God's presence? I don't think he could. I think he was summoned there. You know, come and, it's not, oh, what you've been up to, Satan. The Lord says to Satan, where have you been? You know, it's like his parole hearing. Come and give an account of what you've been doing. And Satan replies, well, I've been going to and fro on the earth. You know, I've been here and I've been there. He's been looking for opportunities to misbehave. And then something bizarre happens, because our third character, God, says to Satan in verse 8, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on earth. He's blameless and upright. He fears God. He shuns evil. This is one of my questions, and I'm not sure I've got an answer for it. Why does the Lord focus Satan's eye on Job? It's one of the big questions of the book. Now, Satan's vicious. It's a courtroom scene. Satan's the prosecutor, if you like. He's looking for victims. And the Lord, who knows all about Satan, says, what do you think about Job? One writer says, it's like a jeweler locking up for the night, and a known thief comes, and as the jeweler's locking up, he says, have you seen this diamond? It's the best, most expensive diamond I've got in the shop. Let me show you it. Now, we'll ask later, and we'll maybe think, well, why did the Lord do that? Why didn't the Lord just not say anything? And Satan says to the Lord, well, he only fears you because you protect him. Job only fears you. Job's only a good Christian bloke because he's rich and he's got kids and he's got good health and he's got all these things. Job only loves you because you blessed him. If you harm him, just watch, he'll soon stop loving you. Take away some of the things that Job has got in life and he'll soon stop loving you. You know, take away his house, take away some of his blessings. He'll soon stop being so holy. And again, surprisingly, the Lord says, okay, everything that he has is in your power. Just don't touch him. You can have all his possessions, do what you want with everything he's got, but don't touch Job. And off Satan goes. And if we only read that, we think, has God been played here? Has Satan laid a trap and God fell into it? So Satan's our character number 2. He's the prosecutor, he's the accuser, he's vicious. His aim is to destroy joy in God. And it's still the same. He might have lost some of the privileges he had, but he's still powerful. We'll see next week he does some terrible things to Job. But it's good to remember as we look at Satan, Satan is subordinate to God. Satan cannot do anything unless God permits it. And that's even true now. As powerful as Satan is powerless unless God gives him permission. Third character, we've already touched on this, is the Lord. God's holding session in heaven, yet he allows Satan to hatch an evil plan. And it teaches 2 things. First, it teaches God is in control of all things. He summons people, and nothing happens without his say-so. Satan can't do anything without the Lord letting him. But secondly, it teaches us this. Whilst God isn't the author of evil, he does permit evil. We've got to get our heads around that. God doesn't create evil, but God permits evil. Satan's work is under God's authority. In that sense, it's from God. God grants limited power to Satan. So 2 things. God's in control of all things. He doesn't author evil, but he does permit it. And the 4th character is Job's friends. We meet 4 of Job's mates. On the one hand, they come and sit with Job, and that's good, but they offer him rubbish advice. They are armchair theologians. Isn't it frustrating? When you're really going through something, you've experienced something personally, and someone flippantly gives you some advice. What do you want to do to them? Job's friends are armchair theologians. Their heart might be in the right place. They're like people who are just sitting in their armchairs and passing on this lovely advice. The most dangerous thing about the theology of Job's friends is that it's mostly sound. 90% of what Job's friends say is good biblical advice. They talk about God's justice, God's holiness. They talk about Job's sin, but they then link Job's sin to his suffering. Do you know the most dangerous thing about things like the prosperity gospel is that it's 90% true? The most dangerous thing about heresy is that it's mostly true. The most dangerous thing about people like Benny Hinn and Kenneth Copeland and Joyce Meyer and them kind of people, most of what they say is true, and it resonates. Job's friends are these armchair theologians that remind us suffering isn't one size fits all, and neither should our counsel be. We counsel people as individuals. We treat people as individuals. So Job's friends come out with many truths, but rubbish conclusions. So they're the characters. Job, Satan, the Lord, and Job's mates. 4th question, what? What's the book about? Mainly it's about suffering, but it's not just about suffering. We know the narrative, don't we? Or we're going to work through it starting next week. Job's got everything. The Lord's blessed him. And everything that he's got that we read of in verse 1 to 5, in the end of the chapter, as we'll see next week, is taken away in a day. He loses everything in a day. His home, his wealth, his kids, his health. And Job suffers more than you could imagine. It's the most devastating picture of loss ever, I think, painted. He loses everything. And he starts to ask questions of God. Honest questions. He starts to question God. And he questions God's response. And God's response teaches us how to view suffering. But more than that, what's this book asking and teaching us? Well, the challenge that Satan lays out in verse 9, I think is key to understanding the whole book. Basically, the challenge that Satan lays out in verse 9 is this. Is it God or God's gifts that Job treasures? Is it God that Job loves, or is it all the things that God gives him? Is it God that you love this morning, or is it all the blessings he's given you? Is Job's godliness linked to his prosperity? Does Job love God because he's well off, or is Job well off because he loves God? Do we love God for who he is, or do we love God for what he gives us? And we've got to be very, very careful how we answer that question. Job's asking us the question, if I lost everything, would I still praise God? Not would I still be happy and smiley, but if I lost everything, would I still trust him? Is God my treasure above everything else? Is he my treasure above my wife and my kids and my home and my career and my health? And it's very easy to say, oh yeah, he is, but will we still worship him? Will we still be faithful if we lose all that? And what the book expects from us, what God expects from us, is that when we suffer, we don't give up. When we suffer, we still trust. Christopher Ash summarizes it really well. 4 things and 1 question, he says. Job really is blameless. Satan really does have influence and power. The Lord really is in absolute control. And the Lord really does give permission for terrible things to happen in the world. And the question is, will Job's faith prove to be real? And the question for us is, through all the trials and sufferings in life, will our faith prove to be real? Is Jesus and his promises enough to sustain us when nothing else will? That's a wheelchair question, isn't it? Not an armchair question. So why? Why do we have this book? Why are we looking at this book? There are a number of whys in Job. First why that I thought in my head, why didn't the Lord stay quiet in verse 8? I say that respectfully. Why didn't the Lord stay quiet in verse 8 rather than showing Satan his prized diamond? Why did the Lord present Job to Satan knowing what Satan would want to do to him? Why is this book written? Well, it's written to show us that, firstly, suffering isn't directly linked to personal sin. Of course, sometimes we do stupid, terrible things, and there are consequences to them. We get that. But this book's written to show us that personal suffering isn't linked to personal sin. One of the first questions we ask, isn't it, when bad things happen is, what have I done wrong? Have I done something wrong? Is God punishing me? Well, Job was the godliest man on the planet, and he suffered horrifically. Good, godly people still suffer. Suffering isn't a straight line to sin. Job didn't suffer for something that he'd done. In fact, you could say, couldn't you? There's only one person that's ever suffered more than Job. And it's probably the one person that was ever godlier than Job. We see that while Job was blameless, he wasn't perfect. I've heard it described like this, which is quite helpful. Job is like a container of water. And this water is lovely and it's clear. But as you shake it up and as you rattle it, bits of sediment come up. And the water becomes a bit cloudy. Well, that's what happens with Job. He doesn't turn against God, doesn't abandon God. But as Job's life's tipped upside down, things get cloudy. He loses a bit of perspective, but he doesn't lose faith. Well, that's what happens to us, isn't it? When we get shaken to the core, we don't lose faith, but we do lose some perspective. And it reminds us again of Jesus, that the only one that's ever been greater than Job, the only person that's ever suffered worse than Job, was completely perfect. When his glass got rattled, when his life got turned upside down, it remained completely pure. So Job teaches that sometimes godly people actually suffer the most. Why does all this happen to Job? Job never finds out. Even when Job's restored at the end, I've given away the ending, when Job gets restored at the end, he never finds out what happened. He'll know now, he'll know in heaven, but he wouldn't have known in his life. Are we willing to settle for that? Lord, I might never know why what's happened until I get to heaven. I'm okay with that because I trust you. There are things that have happened. There are even things that are maybe happening to you now, and you'll never find out why, but God knows. God's in control, but you might not get to the bottom of it till you get to heaven. Can we cope with just trusting him? That's the challenge of Job. Can we cope with trusting him? There are some reasons for suffering, aren't there? You could say God's testing Job, God's proving Job, God's refining Job, God's teaching Job patience. We can say that with us. He's purifying us, he's testing us. But sometimes, here's the thing, sometimes we suffer in life just because God's allowed it. Nothing more, he's allowed it. And why shouldn't he? You know, this life's not perfect, heaven will be perfect. Why shouldn't he allow suffering? And the big challenge is, will we trust him in it? One of the most beautiful verses in Job, I think, is at the height of Job's suffering. He's in mental anguish, he's in physical agony. He thinks that he's convinced that the Lord's punishing him. He doesn't know why the Lord's punishing him. He's saying, Lord, as far as I'm aware, I am innocent. I don't know why you're punishing me like this. And he says, but though he may slay me, I will trust him. That's faith, isn't it? Though he may slay me, I will trust him. That's huge. Job doesn't understand what's happening. He even thinks it's God doing it to him, punishing him. He can't think why. And he says, but I still trust you. How many people walk away from the faith when something little don't go their way? What about us as we go through trials and heartaches that we don't understand, that are painful, that nearly kill us, that don't make sense, that we can never know why? Can we say, Lord, I feel like you're punishing me, Lord, but I trust you. Lord, I can't understand why on earth you'd allow this to happen, but I trust you. Perhaps that's the greatest why of the book. Why does God allow this to happen? Why does God permit this? Well, we could say he does it to display his glory. I think that's true. What does it show when we suffer and trust the Lord? It shows that he's glorious and he's worth it. He does it sometimes to draw out faith. What's God's aims for if God's aim for our life is for us to glorify him, the challenge of Job is this: can we glorify God when our world falls apart? And Job says, well, yeah, you still can. You know, we can glorify God through tears and through happiness. And so this is a tough book, and it's not neat. And it's looking at the question, why do we suffer? Well, sometimes we just suffer because God allows it. And we've got to trust him. Someone summed it up like this: Job-like suffering becomes a context to love, honour, and remain faithful to God for God's sake, irrespective of any secondary blessings he might give, as we accept his present administration of ruling over a still dangerous creation. Job-like suffering becomes a context for us to love, honour, and remain faithful to God for God's sake. Will we love and trust and honour God even when it seems like we're getting nothing for him, just for his sake? As we close, let me share 5 lessons from Job that I picked up from an article that I read this week. First lesson from Job: God is sovereign over all suffering. Now, maybe that don't make us feel better, but it helps me to know my suffering isn't because God's abandoned me. God is sovereign over all suffering. Secondly, God permits Satan to come into our lives and do terrible things. Satan's on a leash, but God does allow him to do certain things. That's why we see evil in the world. That's why we see wickedness in the world. God allows it. You know, why do terrible things happen? Why do wars? Why do bombs drop on people? Because God allows it. Thirdly, God has a purpose to prove our faith and purify our lives through trials. Fourthly, in the end, God will make it good. If not in this life, in the next. In the end, injustice, suffering, pain, God will make it good. Fifthly, and this is important to remember, Satan does not have the last word in the life of God's people. Satan does not have the last word in your life. God does. And as we look at the life and the suffering of Job, we can't do anything else but see Jesus in it. If Job was blameless before God, Jesus was more so. Jesus was the spotless Lamb of God. If Job suffered unjustly to glorify God by thwarting Satan, how much more did Jesus suffer unjustly to glorify God by thwarting Satan? If Job shows imperfect but genuine trust in God in terrible times of suffering, how much more so does Jesus show perfect trust in God in the garden when he says, "Not my will, but yours be done"? If Job felt abandoned by God but actually wasn't, Jesus was abandoned by God. If Job ends with everything being restored and Job being vindicated, how much more will Jesus' story end with all things being restored, him being vindicated, and us being vindicated? As we look at Job, we see a great man. But as we look beyond Job, we see Jesus as a perfect man. We see him as the suffering servant who suffered for us. We can, we know Job was a sinner, but we can say, well, there are things in our life that we need to suffer for. There are things in our life that need consequences. Jesus suffered for them. And so we can't promise neat sermons as we walk through Job, but it is real, isn't it? It's an anchor point for us to think about why things happen, why the Lord allows things, why we suffer. It teaches us that we can and we must always trust God, even when we can't see him. It teaches us that he loves us and is aware even when we don't feel it. And if you're suffering today, I don't want to be one of Job's counselors. That's my fear as we come to this series. I don't want to be one of Job's counselors, giving this armchair theology. I can't tell you why things are happening in your life, and you might never know why things are happening in your life, but the Lord knows. And he's with you because his son suffered even more than Job to defeat Satan, so that one day Satan will never be able to touch us. One day everything will be made right. And nothing's more certain of that, but Job teaches that until that day, God does expect us to trust him. We're going to close with singing a hymn. I know you all know the backstory to this. I'll just tell you briefly. A bloke, really godly minister, his wife and kids had come over to England while he was in America. The boat sunk. His wife and kids died. He got on the first boat he could to get to them. And when he got to the point where the boat had sunk, the captain of the boat said, "This is where your wife and your kids died." And he went to his room and he wrote this song. And the theme of this song is, "It is well with my soul." He trusted God even when his world was falling apart. He couldn't see. "Even though you may slay me, yet will I trust you." So let's sing "When Peace Like a River."